This reading is from the UU Reverend Eric Walker Wickstrom. Why do people pray? What does it bring to spirituality? Is there a someone or something that we encounter in our times of prayer, a sacred something that is yearning for relationship with us? Is prayer the building of a relationship or simply an internal monologue with one's own subconscious mind? We want to know with whom we are engaging, whether or not there is a whom before we will engage. But really, all this does is distract our concentrated energy from the true task before us, which is the spiritual journey. And no words can describe the spiritual journey. You must experience it for yourself. And this is not the approach most people associate with religion. Instead, after having been given a lot of concepts they are expected to understand, or at least memorize, people are often invited to fit their experiences into prefabricated cubbyholes. This is what God is, they are told. Now go and find him. This is what spiritual experience feels like. So now go and have one. For a lot of us, this doesn't work too well. At some point, we get stuck in the concepts, unable to see beyond them, and so we find nothing. Not all religions are like this, however. In his interview with Bill Moyers, Joseph Campbell told the story of a Shinto priest who was attending an interfaith religious conference. Someone asked him if he could explain the Shinto theology or ideology. The priest thought for a moment and then replied, "We don't have a theology. We don't have an ideology. We dance." There are other traditions like this, of course, that do not put such weight on the working of the mind. Traditions that do not imply that we can think our way to a spiritual life. But many of us do not come from such a tradition. So what can we do? If we start our search with the idea, the ideology, the theory, or the theology, we may find ourselves unable to find anything. It's in something experiential, like the Shinto priest's dance, when we have a first-hand, unqualified, unfiltered experience of the sacred and the holy. Here, the experience precedes the theology. Rather than trying to fit the experience into a predefined concept, we can define the concepts only in light of what we have learned in our lives. This may seem radical, yet it is the path that mystics and contemplatives have been suggesting from time immemorial. If you long to connect with the sacred, if you desire to live a life that is more in touch with the holy, stop listening for something and start simply listening. If you have given up on an anthropomorphic deity, the old white guy with a long white beard, or any of his stand-ins, yet can't figure out what to put in its place, stop looking for something and start simply looking around you. Notice those places in your life where you have felt yourself in the presence of the holy. Remember those experiences in which you have heard your own connectedness. Seek in your own life, your own feelings, your own moments. Those places where you have encountered or are encountering the sacred. In other words, simply pray. Pray without any preconceived notion of what you're doing or why. Simply do it and see what happens. After you pray, then begin to think. Think about what your experiences tell you about the holy. Think about what those experiences tell you about the way the world works and the Spirit moves. Build your theology on your experience rather than the other way around. Define the divine for yourself through your own experiences rather than seeking experiences that match someone else's definition. we often can't see where the sacred is moving in our lives because of what we've been taught to expect. So many people have given up on religion, on God, because they look and look where they've been told to look, but always end up feeling disappointed. And that is why I know of no more important activity than prayer, connecting and reconnecting to the source of our lives, to that sacred mystery in which we live and move and have our being. All right. That reading is from a book called Simply Pray, Modern Spiritual Practice to Deepen Your Life, and it serves as a basis for this sermon. In the book, Reverend Eric Wickstrom provides a really good case for people of any religion or no religion to begin a prayer practice, even if you are agnostic or atheist, because prayer isn't dependent on someone listening to it, at least no one other than the person doing the praying. Contrary to what many of us have been taught, having a God or God-like figure to pray to is not required. My own experience with prayer growing up in the United Methodist Church was very short and stunted. I quit Sunday school by the 4th grade, so my knowledge of prayer never developed beyond a primary schooler's understanding of it. I remember thinking that praying meant asking God for things, kind of like you ask Santa Claus for things. I never even recall praying for anyone other than myself. I probably missed that day in Sunday school and never learned about that. Prayer was also something that I never learned about at home. Even the little dinner time blessings and the little bedtime prayers families do, they were not practiced in my family. And if either one of my parents were praying people, they never shared that with me. So I eventually gave up my silent bedtime prayers when it occurred to me that a personal God listening to my prayers and responding to them seemed very unrealistic and not very consistent with the reality I had come to know as a 6th grader. So I stopped praying. And I was not only rejecting prayer, but I was also rejecting the Santa Claus God, the only God I knew at the time. And that's where my experience of spirituality, religion, and the divine stalled out. And it didn't get going again until I was well into my adulthood. So my story about God and prayer is pretty typical among Unitarian Universalists. A lot of us, I think, can share similar stories. And although I don't have a lot of regrets about my prior spiritual and religious life, I do see a missed opportunity in my religious upbringing. If I had not become a Sunday school dropout and stayed in the church, would I have learned more about prayer as spiritual practice? I don't know. If my understanding of prayer had been expanded to something deeper and more insightful than Santa Claus prayers, and my notion of God as something more expansive than a false Santa Claus, would I have been able to get into it, appreciate it, learn and grow from it? I'm still not sure. But what I'm sure about now is that it's time for me to take a new look at prayer, as should other UUs who gave up on the prayers of their childhood or never prayed at all. Because, if we reject prayer as a viable spiritual practice, we're really throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Not to mention we're throwing away a potential gateway to spiritual growth that might work for many of us. Because after all, when all is said and done, we are still seekers. As religious people, we're looking to go deeper. We're looking to go beyond the surfaces of our lives. We're looking for something beyond our mundane daily activities. We are hopefully looking beyond cheap and short-lived thrills, beyond material things, and beyond external achievements, all those things that our civil society tells us we should want and we need in order to have a happy and fulfilled life. So we really can't afford to scoff at prayer. when it just might be the key to improving our self-awareness and better understanding of our place and purpose in this really mysterious universe we inhabit. And what we're really talking about here is getting in touch with the transcendent, that something greater, that mysterious something larger, something whole, and that something does not have to be supernatural. But I do recommend it be something larger than yourself, because self-worship really isn't a good idea for a lot of reasons. But your something larger could be ultimate reality, or the universe, or one of the many other words for something bigger mentioned in that poem that served as our opening words. World religions have many different techniques for connecting to that something greater. So many spiritual practices. We've got meditation and Tai Chi and ritual and hundreds of others. And prayer is simply just another option on this enormous spiritual practice menu. In his research, Eric Wickstrom discovered there are 4 types of prayer practiced by almost every religion. And Christianity has fancy names for those 4 types of prayer, but he chose to pick more practical, less scary, more universal names. His 4 types of prayer are called naming, knowing, listening, and loving. Naming is naming the many ways that the holy and the sacred move in our lives and the wider world. Knowing is knowing ourselves fully in both our strengths and weaknesses. The third, listening, is listening to that voice of quiet stillness that resides in each of us. And 4 is reaching out in loving concern to the world around us. So when we stop worrying about why we should pray or to whom we should pray and just do it, we can develop a prayer practice that works for us, whatever our context, whatever our theology. So you might be wondering what a UU-friendly prayer practice may look like. It incorporates all 4 of these types of prayer, and I'm going to give you a little bit more information on each one. So that first type, the naming involves invoking that something greater on which your prayer is focused, even if that something greater doesn't really have ears or the ability to listen. Because having a place to direct your attention and your intention is really important. And this something greater, it needs a name. Because naming is the first step of developing a relationship. Having a name is the first step in relating to something. Let's say if I pray to the generous universe, I'm not expecting the generous universe will really be listening to and responding to my prayers, but yet I need some place to focus my attention, my concentration and intention. And in naming what we're praying to, we are identifying that which is most sacred to us. Eric Wickstrom says, to give voice to how and where we have encountered the holy or where we have felt the divine in our lives. And that is really important work. Naming prayer encourages us to look at our lives and discover where the sacred is present. But still, if you find the idea of something greater too uncomfortable, your naming prayer practice can be simply about gratitudes, naming all the things you have to be grateful for. And it's definitely worth a shot. Research is showing that people who focus on gratitude in prayer or in journaling generally report greater feelings of well-being than those who do not. So the second type of prayer is knowing. It's a knowing prayer where we gently acknowledge our faults and our broken places so that we may work to overcome them, heal them, or at least minimize them. It isn't about being perfect or trying to be perfect. It's not about shaming yourself or guilt. It's really just about giving voice to the broken, wounded, and worried places in our souls. 12-step groups call this a fearless moral inventory. Others might call it facing our darkness. To live a healthy spiritual life, we have to thrive towards being authentic, whole people. And to be able to be whole, we have to know where our weak parts are, where our hurting parts are, if we want to live an authentic life. Knowing prayer can help us figure out where we are stuck, where we're getting in our own way or hurting others, coming to terms with the qualities in ourselves that we would rather not acknowledge, seeing ourselves objectively from the outside as perhaps another person would. The third type of prayer is called listening, and this one can be equated with the meditation practices of Eastern religion or the contemplative practices of Western religious traditions. And as you might guess, this type of prayer is all about silencing and centering, taking a break from the noise of the world and the noise in our own minds. This is prayer beyond words, without words. It's a space to realize the sacredness surrounding us and the sacred within us. Because when we calmly observe our existence without internal commentary of our thoughts and those feelings that come out of those thoughts, we really do open ourselves to glimpses of what, we might call the divine or oneness. So the listening practice encourages us to live in the most important moment. And the most important moment is the present. The whole point of the listening prayer is to bypass those thoughts and actually have a direct experience of ultimate reality. The final type of prayer in Eric Wickstrom's 4-pack is called loving prayer. This is also what I like to call the "it's not all about you" kind of prayer. This is the prayer that focuses on our connections, our interconnections, our communities, and goes beyond our more self-centered concerns. Now, when it comes to praying for others, it's sometimes really easy to miss the point. Even if you don't believe that prayers can send positive or healing energy, there is still plenty of reason to pray for others. It's about acknowledging our interdependence. And as the greatest mystics of all traditions have realized, that we are all one and that our destinies are bound together. Loving prayer cultivates compassion, the ability to suffer with others. And the internalizing of the suffering of others is what really compels us to act in service of others. And it's just so way too easy to anesthetize ourselves from human suffering just by avoiding it, not looking at it, not feeling it. But Eric Wickstrom says loving prayer invites us to open our eyes, ears, and hearts to the struggles of others near and far. And loving prayer also includes praying for those people we don't like or who have hurt us or with whom we have conflict or unfinished business. I imagine these as some of the hardest prayers there are to pray, but that's probably why they need to be prayed, and not for the reason we often think. These prayers don't need to be prayed for the other person, right? They need to be prayed for ourselves, because it really isn't helpful to hold on to negative feelings, to anger and aggravation. All that is so bad. It's bad for our bodies, it's bad for our mind, it's bad for our spirits, it's really bad for our relationships. So this type of loving prayer is about giving voice to and letting go of our pent-up hostilities so we ourselves can be released from their captivity. And there's actually been some research into the ability of prayers to heal or improve the well-being of those who are ill. It's far from conclusive, but at least one double-blind study of hospital patients who were prayed for by strangers, whether they knew they were being prayed for by strangers or not, showed lower death rates and fewer complications than those who were not prayed for. It's a little mind-blowing, isn't it? And it's also something to keep in mind next time someone offers to pray for you. So loving prayer is about opening our hearts and minds to the needs of others and the world around us. And it's also good for our own spirits. Our capacities for love and understanding and compassion increase. And also, it's perfectly okay to offer yourself a loving prayer too. So using those 4 types of prayer, Eric Wickstrom actually developed a prayer bead practice for UUs. So it's not uncommon now to go to a UU camp or a convention or a class to make UU prayer beads. Here are mine. Here they are. I made these in a class in seminary. So that's what they look like. So with this bead practice, it really kind of takes a commitment. Doing all of the beads can actually take 30 to 60 minutes if you do them all at once. But it's also perfectly okay to break up the practice throughout the day and do a few at a time. I'll put some resources on Facebook for anyone who is curious about making their own UU beads and starting a bead practice. So after examining the types of prayer and what a UU prayer practice may look like, you still might be wondering, well, what's the point? What's the point of this or any other spiritual practice? I don't need these things to become a better person, a moral person, or to check in on myself and my own behavior, or remember to care about others. And that's absolutely true. Lots of people have led decent, productive lives without any type of religion or spiritual practice. And ultimately, the decision is up to you. But going deeper does have its rewards. It can be a little scary. It can be uncomfortable. Again, who really wants to take their demons out for a turn on the dance floor? But getting out of our heads that are overfull with the reeling thoughts and feelings that we're actually kind of addicted to, spiritual practice of any kind is a commitment, and it's not necessarily easy. But, when I look for a rationale for why do we do this, the reason why spiritual practice is so necessary, I look to one of our own Unitarian heroes, Henry David Thoreau, who said this: "Why should we live in such a hurry and waste of life? We are determined to be starved before we are hungry. I wish to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life. I want to learn what life has to teach, and not when I come to die discover that I have not lived. I do not wish to live what is not life. Living is so dear. Nor do I wish to practice resignation unless it's quite necessary. I want to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life." Today, my wish for all of us is to live our lives this way, deliberately, consciously, and wasting not a moment of the precious time we have. And it's spiritual practice that can help make that wish come true. May it be so, and blessed be.